And in looking at what you guys talked about when prompted to describe the process you just went through from design and development, you basically describe the experience as a piece of cake. Not. In general, you talked about the challenges but also the rewards of working in this project. Regarding the most difficult aspect, you mentioned content related challenges. So for example, selecting the content, since you guys were the subject matter experts as well as the designers, you had to make that decision yourself. And also figuring out the scope, how much you can do in a project of this length. Also, regarding design decisions, you talked about how you had challenges in designing and implementing assessment, deciding on a technology to use to create your modules, and also how much learner control versus guidance you could give your students. Regarding the process, you guys talked about the adjustments along the way that you had to do. You guys talked about how it was challenging because of the multiple roles, being the developer, designer, subject matter expert, etc. You talked about challenges in audio and video editing, especially because of background noise. And also when you were coming back to a process you had done in the past, you mentioned it was challenging at first to remember the details of how to go about doing the process. And finally, you mentioned some of the constraints were challenging, and so basically time management, given the time we had to do the project, but also the limited resources with which you could approach doing this project. Regarding previous knowledge, skills, and dispositions that you have found helpful for the project, you mentioned technical skills. So for example, knowing about web design or graphic design, knowing about the technology that you were going to use to implement the e-learning module, and also knowledge of instructional design or pedagogy or online learning was helpful in developing this module. Regarding the tools, basically this is an area where the same issues can be either positive or negative depending on their nature. So for example, positive about the tool was its flexibility, the ease of use, the array of tools that provided for you to develop the module, the cost, especially with free tools, how much the free tool resembled a paid version with which you had been used to working, the opportunity for support, and the level of use of the tool was also one of the positive signs. In the negative side, you talked about the lack of flexibility of a particular tool, technical issues that you experienced along the way, the cost of additional plugins, the lack of support, and also the cost when it was prohibitive because the tool was commercial. You also discussed development competencies needed moving forward, and you mentioned knowledge of new platforms, so you were really interested in continuing to learn other programs to be able to develop e-learning modules. More practice with this kind of process, and also engaging in projects of a larger scope so that it would give you more experience at other levels of e-learning content development. You guys talked about previous experience working with developers, and although not everybody had previous experience, you basically talked first and foremost about the communication that needs to be established between designers and developers, and how when changes are necessary, when you need to go back and forth making decisions, communication was key. Regarding how development changes in the future, you mentioned it is possible that the changes are going to be tied to developments in tools and pedagogy. You think there are going to be more authoring tools, and that's given the trend where at the beginning we had to have technical knowledge about things like HTML, whereas now you can develop a website without knowing HTML. You mentioned the need to develop for multiple platforms. As we know, we've always had to deal with Mac computers versus PC computers, Internet Explorer versus Firefox or Chrome, but now we also have mobile devices and mobile devices of different types to access e-learning content. And we need to develop for those in the future. You talked about the necessity of having multi-skilled employees as opposed to people who are experts in one particular area. But also you mentioned how collaboration among experts would happen at a virtual level more and more.